everyone. My name is Marcus Golding. I'm a PhD candidate in the history department at the University of Texas at Austin. First of all, I'm happy to join you all remotely and being part of the Prague Research and Teaching Conference. And I'm also happy to join my colleagues, Dr. Erika Besumek and Rachel Hossein, in exploring a little bit more different facets and aspects of ClioVis. So in this panel, today I'm gonna share a little bit more about how you can use ClioVis for your own research. I have used it for my own dissertation. My dissertation focuses on the history of foreign oil companies, mainly American and British oil companies in Venezuela in the 20th century, and how they went from being completely unconcerned by local needs to be fully committed to the idea of corporate social responsibility, and how they actually implemented this policy with investments not only in their workers but in communities, in education, infrastructure, and other sectors that help in the national development and modernization of Venezuela. So I have three research cases that I want to show you that are good examples of how ClioVis has helped me to visualize my arguments, to uncover patterns, and even to uncover patterns in the data, and even build social network maps. So let's get started. So the first research case that I want to show you is the one that you're seeing in the background. This essentially is an example of how I visualize what the literature says about conflict in the Venezuelan petroleum industry, and by this I mean specifically labor management relations, and what my argument is, or how I challenge the literature consensus around conflict in the Venezuelan petroleum industry. So as you can see right now, there are three events that you can clearly see in the timeline. And the first one essentially summarizes the main arguments about how the interactions between foreign oil companies and local workers are often violent and repressive. So in essence, if there is no conflictive discourse, if there's no violence in a way or the other, labor activism is rendered invisible. That's the consensus of this literature. And here in the references, you can see several authors that have contributed to this literature, studying cases in Saudi Arabia, in Mexico, in Colombia, in Nigeria. And this is predominantly the lens also applied to the Venezuelan oil industry. In these other two events, you can see how this, what I call confrontational labor activism lens, is applied to the Venezuelan case. There are two hallmark events in the Venezuelan oil industry, where two nationwide strikes that sum up what labor management relations were in the Venezuelan oil industry, according to the literature consensus. Essentially, these are the only two events worth analyzing, given their violent and conflictive nature. But bear in mind that these oil companies were present in Venezuela from the 1920s to 1976 with the nationalization of the industry. So there were plenty of other occasions where there was conflict. However, since we're applying only a confrontational labor activism lens, we are essentially ignoring other forms of labor activism. So let's see what happens when we apply a transformative labor activism, which is the one which I use to analyze the dynamism and interactions between laborers and foreign oil managers. And when we turn it on, you start seeing a lot of activity. Here I have recorded all the collective bargaining agreements that these unions and companies negotiated every 3 years starting in 1945. It was a crucial component to channel worker grievances peacefully. But there were also protests. All these small events here are protests that happened throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And workers also recruited the help of the labor ministry to put pressure on the companies. So instead of violently confronting these workers and risking the ire of the Venezuelan government, and who knows, the potential threat of being expelled from the country, foreign oil companies showed a great deal of pragmatism that greatly facilitated conflict resolution in their dealings with both unions and the government through a three-pronged strategy conceding socioeconomic demands to workers through the collective bargaining contracts, sidelining radical unions while working with moderate labor unions, and cooperating with the Venezuelan government through subsidies and investments. Foreign oil companies were able to secure a good degree of industrial peace that lasted until the nationalization of the industry. So to sum up, this hopefully shows you how you can create timelines that show what is the literary consensus and how you are challenging it or contributing to it in some way or the other. And I find the categories pretty helpful to highlight that. So let's move on to the next example. The second timeline that I would like to show you all is a small literary analysis that I did to again visualize one of the arguments that I made in my dissertation, which is that literary writers influenced the popular imagination of the Venezuelan oil industry. Essentially, they influenced in a negative way the presence of foreign capital in the Venezuelan oil industry. They depicted them as exploiters of the national resources, of the workers, as entities that polluted the environment, and so on. And this is very important because when the nationalization comes in the 1970s, this is a sentiment that politicians will use to mobilize the Venezuelan people towards the nationalization of the industry and to justify the exit of foreign capital from the Venezuelan industry. So this timeline essentially asks, okay, how did this narrative begin? How it was built and developed? Well, the first thing that is worth noticing, again, categories are super helpful here. I created two labels to describe the main topics in each novel that talks about the Venezuelan oil industry. So I'm going to turn off this one and show you the first label. So these are novels that depict the presence of foreign oil companies in Venezuela and deal with topics such as racism, pollution, resistance to foreign capital, oppression, and gender dynamics. And I have in total 5 novels that I analyzed, and from those 5, we have that 3 at least deal with those topics. Then, when we turn on the blue label and stick with the green one, we will find out that there are only 2 novels that deviate from the other 3 and also show and that they're a little bit more nuanced. They show process of modernization, political, social, and economic changes, and instances of investments, progress, prosperity as well from this economic model and the presence of these foreign oil companies. So a brief preliminary analysis shows you that most of the novels had already a negative view of the foreign oil companies. Now let's explore who wrote them. You can find that at least 3, or not at least 3 of the novelists did not work for the petroleum industry. This is important because they didn't have direct knowledge of what was going on in the oil industry as such. And essentially there are these 3 authors, Gabriel Ángel Bracho Montiel, Rufino Blanco Fombona, and Miguel Otero Silva. 2 of them were politically active and were part of the Venezuelan Communist Party. And the other one opposed the dictatorship of Juan Vicente Gomez, who was the president that allowed the foreign oil companies to come to the country. And during his reign, he profited from dealing with these foreign oil companies. Now, if we look at those authors that worked for the petroleum industry, we only have two. Gustavo Coronel, who wrote El petróleo viene de la luna, and César Uribe Piedradita, a Colombian, who wrote a novel called Mancha de Aceite. They both worked directly for the foreign oil companies and had knowledge of how things worked in the industry. So we have all this useful information. But now, why this growing national narrative about the foreign oil industry influenced by these writers was so negative toward foreign oil capital? Essentially because of a problem of context. And this is why this timeline is so helpful to stress this point. Because if you see, most of these writers were born towards the end of the 19th century or early 20th century. And this was a moment up to the 1930s where conditions in the Venezuelan oil industry run by these foreign oil companies were bad. Workers didn't have many rights, they were exploited, companies didn't care much about their welfare, and all of this was sanctioned by the dictatorship of Juan Vicente Gomez, who allowed companies to basically do whatever they wanted without demanding much from them besides profits. Moreover, many of them were persecuted by the dictator of Juan Vicente Gomez, such as the case of Gabriel Ángel Bracho Montiel and Miguel Otero Silva. Others, like César Uribe Piedradita, though Colombian, was also politically active in communist circles. And it's also interesting to notice that he came to work for the foreign oil companies in 1923. So a moment in which the labor situation in the oil camps was pretty bad. All of them were published between the 1930s and 1960s and were grounded in the narratively in the 1920s, 1930s. So none of them really account for the transformation that later took place when these companies started to adopt corporate social responsibility practices and negotiating bargaining contracts, labor bargaining contracts with workers. None of them account for that. The only one that does that is Gustavo Coronel, who is the only one that was born in 1935, and actually he is still alive. And he worked, and he is a Venezuelan engineer who had a full career in the Venezuelan oil industry, working for Royal Dutch Shell and eventually the state-owned oil company. And his book is the only one that provides a more nuanced account of the bad things, but also the good things that the foreign petroleum industry brought to Venezuela in terms of education, in terms of social mobility, and so on. So this is just a quick example. I cannot elaborate further, but this is a really good example of how you can do literary analysis and raise important issues like context to understand how a national narrative is born and developed or built, but also how it's fixated in a specific period. Now, to conclude, let's move on to the last case. In this timeline, I want to show you how I built a social network map showing essentially the professional trajectory of Venezuelans that work for the foreign oil companies, and then the subsequent professional roles that they had throughout their lives, either in the oil industry, in government, or in other organizations like OPEC, or in civil society organizations as well. I built this social network map because in one of my chapters in the dissertation, I argue that these foreign oil companies starting in the 1940s implemented a policy of Venezolanization of the industry. That means that they started hiring and training Venezuelans at all levels of the corporate ladder. And this resulted in incredible social mobility for Venezuelans. Many of them eventually became directors. Many of them were members of the board of directors of these subsidiaries, and some of them even joined the parent company in the US. And this part of my argument is visualized here and allows us to see not only the quantity, and here I'm just focusing on the 1930s and 1940s, And I added just a few cases from my database. I don't have all of them here because to avoid the timeline to be too crowded. But it only shows the quantity of those Venezuelans that benefited from working for these foreign companies, but also the quality by showing their progression through time and the roles that they had. And just to show you some interesting examples, I'm going to focus on those employees that work for the oil companies and eventually left and had other roles. So if we turn off this yellow label and focus on the green ones, you will find interesting connections. So here, for instance, we have the case of Aníbal Martinez and several nodes connecting to this event. In this timeline, I'm depicting institutions and people. So here in the labels, you can see Venezuelan government, career employees in other roles, Venezuelan oil companies, civil society organizations. And in the case of Aníbal Martinez, he's a really interesting person because he had different affiliations. He worked for Royal Dutch Shell, the Creole Petroleum Corporation. Then he had a role in the Venezuelan government. Then he also worked for OPEC. And then he founded his own civil society organization to defend Venezuelan oil prices internationally and lobby for that. And here I compiled the trajectory of this Venezuelan from being an engineer for Royal Dutch Shell to a geologist, then working for the Creole Petroleum Corporation as a head geology, then working as an advisor for the Ministry of Mines and Hydrocarbons in Venezuela, to then being a member of the Secretariat of OPEC, and then a founder of the civil society organization. Another interesting case that I can show you as well is Humberto Peñalosa, who also had multiple affiliations. He worked for the Creole Petroleum Corporation, then went as director of petroleum economy in the Ministry of Mines and Hydrocarbons. And this is interesting because these companies were training these Venezuelans, and many of them transitioned to government roles and came with the mentality and the teachings that they received from these foreign companies. So that vision, that business vision, also influenced oil legislation. So this, as you can see, can help you show the quality and quantity of this policy of Venezolanization and the different connections and the different trajectories that these workers and managers had throughout their life in the industry. So hopefully this also helps you to think about how you can use social networks or use ClioVis to build social networks and start depicting connections and draw conclusions from different bits of data to make arguments, either to uncover new arguments or to visualize or to support arguments that you are making elsewhere. So these are the three cases that I wanted to share with you. I hope they are of help. If you would like to reach out and explore further how to use research, how to use ClioVis to do research, please feel free to email me. I'm very happy to collaborate with you and help you think about how to use ClioVis creatively for research purposes.